On 18 October, Admiral Gormley was relieved, and the South Pacific area received a new commander, Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. Admiral Halsey, then 59 years of age, was one of the most experienced officers of the United States Navy. Graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1904 as a passed midshipman, Halsey was commissioned as an ensign in 1906. During World War I, he commanded destroyers in British waters. He attended the Navy and Army War Colleges in 1933 and 1934, and then successfully completed the Naval Aviators course at Pensacola. His career thereafter had been chiefly concerned with aircraft and aircraft carriers. From 1935 to 1937, he commanded the carrier Saratoga. After serving for a year as commanding officer at Pensacola, he took command, as a rear admiral, of Carrier Division II Yorktown and Enterprise in 1938. The next year he led Carrier Division I Saratoga and Lexington, and in 1940, a vice admiral, he led the aircraft battle force of the Pacific Fleet. Halsey had been on the high seas with a carrier task force at the time the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, and his undamaged task force was fortunately available for a series of raids against the Gilbert, Marshall, Wake, and Marcus Islands in the spring of 1942. He also commanded the task force which took Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle's medium bombers to within striking distance of Tokyo in April 1942. Illness had kept him out of the Battle of Midway, but the aggressive admiral had now returned to active service, and his audacious spirit was to have a dynamic effect upon the South Pacific. Although he was unable to visit Guadalcanal until 8 November, Admiral Halsey was well aware of the difficulties which faced him. He had at once to decide whether Guadalcanal should be evacuated or held. On 20 October, following the heavy bombardments and the landings of Hyakutake's troops, General Vandegrift had reported in person to Admiral Halsey aboard the flagship Argonne in Noumea Harbour. Present at the meeting were Lieutenant General Thomas H. Holcomb, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, who was on a tour of inspection, General Harmon, Admiral Turner, and Major General Alexander M. Patch, who commanded the American Division. Vandegrift informed Halsey that he could hold Guadalcanal if he was given stronger support. The Admiral knew that Guadalcanal must be held, and promised the support of all his available forces. One of his first orders sent Kincaid's force to the Santa Cruz Islands, where it engaged the Japanese on 26 October. The South Pacific area was soon to receive additional means by which the aggressive spirit could be transformed into action. President Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff recognized that the situation on Guadalcanal was extremely serious. On 21 October, Admiral King, after an urgent request from the South Pacific for more forces, notified Admiral Nimitz that the Joint Chiefs of Staff had approved a much stronger air establishment for the South Pacific to be based there by 1 January 1943. On 24 October, President Roosevelt, in a memorandum for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, expressed a desire that the Joint Chiefs send every possible weapon to Guadalcanal and North Africa, even if additional shipments meant reducing commitments elsewhere. In reply, Admiral King stated that a considerable force would be diverted, including 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, 2 destroyers, and 24 submarines, plus torpedo boats, 75 fighter aircraft, 41 dive and 15 torpedo bombers. 30 transports had been allocated to the South Pacific for November, and 20 additional 7,000-ton ships would be diverted later. In his reply to the President, General Marshall stated that the situation in the South Pacific depended upon the outcome of the battle then in progress for Guadalcanal. The ground forces in the South Pacific were sufficient for security against the Japanese, he felt, and he pointed out that the effectiveness of ground troops depended upon the ability to transport them to and maintain them in the combat areas. Total Army air strength in the South Pacific then consisted of 46 heavy bombers, 27 medium bombers, and 133 fighters. 23 heavy bombers were being flown, and 53 fighters shipped from Hawaii to meet the emergency. MacArthur had been directed to furnish bomber reinforcements and P-38 replacement parts to the South Pacific. General Marshall had taken the only additional measures which, besides the possible diversion of the 25th Division from MacArthur's area to the South Pacific, were possible the temporary diversion of 3 heavy bombardment squadrons from Australia to New Caledonia, and the release of P-40s and P-39s from Hawaii and Christmas Island. In October, the Japanese had come perilously close to destroying American air strength on Guadalcanal. Despite their utmost efforts, the airfield remained in American hands and recovered from the heavy blows, although Guadalcanal's air strength, impaired by operational losses and Japanese bombardment, remained low during the rest of October. Only 34 aircraft were fit to fly on 16 October, but were reinforced on that date by the arrival of 20 F-4Fs and 12 SBDs. By 26 October, after a series of bombing raids and shelling, there were but 29 operational aircraft at Henderson Field, 12 F-4Fs, 11 SBDs, 3 P-400s, and 3 P-39s. By the end of November, with the lessening of Japanese attacks against the Lunga area and the increase of Allied strength in the South Pacific, the Guadalcanal Air Force had increased in size, although as late as 10 November the shortage of fuel prevented heavy bombers from using Henderson Field. General MacArthur on 14 November promised to send 8 P-38s to the South Pacific. By the middle of November, a total of 1,748 men in the aviation units were operating at the Lunga airfields 1,261 of Marine Air Group 14, 294 of Marine Air Group 142, 33 naval pilots, 144 of the 347th Army Fighter Group, and 16 of the 37th Army Fighter Squadron. By 21 November, the entire 5th Army Heavy Bombardment Group, which like the 11th had participated in the Battle of Midway, had reached the South Pacific to operate from Espiritu Santo. P-38s had reached Guadalcanal to be based there permanently, and B-17s were using the field regularly, although the fuel shortage still limited operations. On 24 November, 94 aircraft on Guadalcanal were operational, including 15 P-39s, 1 P-40, 8 B-17s, 11 P-38s, 9 TBFs, 6 New Zealand Hudsons, 29 F-4Fs, and 15 SBDs, and by 30 November, additional reinforcements had increased the total to 188 planes of all types. By November, plans for building an additional airfield on Guadalcanal were ready to be put into effect. Prior to Admiral Halsey's assumption of command, the 1st Battalion of the 147th Infantry, a separate regiment, had sailed from Tongatabu with the mission of occupying Ndeni. General Harmon had not changed his conviction that the occupation of Dendeni would be a needless waste of effort. He presented his opinions to Halsey, who, after conferring with his subordinates, accepted Harmon's views. On 20 October, he directed the 147th Infantry to Guadalcanal. The Andini operation was never carried out. Halsey decided to send the 147th Infantry to Guadalcanal to cover the construction of an airstrip at a point far enough east of the Lunga to give fighter planes at Lunga Point enough time to rise to the attack if the Japanese attacked the eastern field. Aola Bay, lying about 33 miles east-southeast of Lunga Point, was selected by Admiral Turner as the landing and airfield site. The Aola Bay Landing Force, as finally constituted, was under command of Colonel W. B. Tuttle and included 1,700 men of the 1st Battalion, 147th Infantry, 2 companies of the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, a detachment of the 5th Defence Battalion, Provisional Battery K of the 246th Field Artillery Battalion of the Americal Division, which was equipped with British 25-pounders, and 500 naval construction troops. While the practicality of taking Ndeni was being considered, Halsey's headquarters had completed plans for moving strong reinforcements to Lunga Point. On 29 October, Admiral Turner informed General Vandegrift that his requests for more ammunition, material and support were being seriously considered. The Admiral planned to have 2 ships' land stores, ammunition, and 2 batteries of 155mm guns on 2 November. Provision for the movement of the 8th Marines of the 2nd Marine Division to Guadalcanal was being given the highest priority, and that regiment was to land on 3 November. Turner expressed the desire, somewhat gratuitously, that Vandegrift take the offensive after the arrival of the 8th Marines. Another Army regiment and the 1st Marine Aviation Engineer Battalion, Turner announced, were to arrive about 10 November, and the 2nd Raider Battalion might possibly land at Beaufort Bay on the south coast about the same time. A task force commanded by Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan was constituted to transport the 8th Marines and the Aola Force to Guadalcanal. The Aola Force carried on 3 transports and 2 destroyer transports landed unopposed at Aola Bay on 4 November. It established a 600-yard-long beachhead a short distance east of the Aola River. When the beachhead had been established, command of Colonel Tuttle's landing force passed from Admiral Callahan to General Vandegrift. The transports unloaded continuously until 2 a.m., 6 November, and then withdrew. Admiral Halsey directed the raider companies to remain at Aola Bay, instead of leaving with the transports as originally planned. The troops established a perimeter defense, and on 29 November 4 transports landed the 3rd Battalion of the 147th Infantry, additional elements of the 246th Field Artillery Battalion, part of the 9th Marine Defence Battalion, and more Seabees. The Seabees had begun work on an airfield immediately after the landing on 4 November, but the entire area proved to be unsatisfactory. The earth was swampy, and tree stumps with deep, tangled roots slowed the process of clearing the ground. On 22 November, Vandergrift, who from the first had opposed the selection of Aola Bay, recommended to Turner that the area be abandoned. Admiral Fitch, the commander of South Pacific land-based aircraft, also disapproved of the Aola Bay site. Halsey assented to its abandonment, and the Aola force, less the 2nd Raider Battalion, was later removed to Volinavua at Koli Point to build an airfield on a grassy plain. The movement to Koli Point was completed by 3 December, and there the force was joined by the 18th Naval Construction Battalion and the rest of the 9th Defence Battalion. While the initial landings at Aola Bay were being effected on 4 November, more American troops and weapons were strengthening Lunga Point. The Alciba and the Fuller landed stores and ammunition, together with 1 Army and 1 Marine Corps 155mm gun battery at Lunga Point on 2 November. These batteries, F Battery of the 244th Coast Artillery Battalion and another battery of the 5th Defence Battalion, brought in the heaviest American artillery which had been sent to Guadalcanal up to that time, the first suitable for effective counter-battery fire. After the landing of a Japanese force east of Koli Point on the night of 2 to 3 November, Vandergrift asked Halsey to hurry the arrival of the 8th Marines. Callahan's task force, which had been delayed by the proximity of enemy forces, sailed into Sealark Channel on 4 November to debark the reinforced 8th Marines, including the 75mm pack howitzers of the 1st Battalion, 10th Marines, and the Aola force. The regular noon Japanese air attack forced the transports to disperse, and the Lunga Point section of Callahan's task force withdrew to the southeast for the night. It returned the next morning to complete the unloading before sailing for Noumea. Following their defeat in the night battles of 23 to 26 October, the Japanese began preparing for a second major counteroffensive. Staff representatives from the combined fleet hurried to Guadalcanal by destroyer to help complete the plans. On 26 October, General Hyakutake decided to send the 38th Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Tadayoshi Sano, and its heavy equipment from Rabaul to Guadalcanal on transports instead of aboard the Tokyo Express. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet, approved of these plans. The Japanese organized 4 naval task forces for the November operation. 2 bombardment forces were to neutralize Henderson Field. A third was to transport the 38th Division and heavy equipment from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, while a 4th force from the combined fleet gave general support. The 17th Army had first decided to land the 38th Division at Koli Point, whereupon the entire 17th Army was to attack the Lunga area from the east and west. But Imperial General Headquarters, disapproving of the dispersion of forces, directed that the 38th Division deliver its attack from the Matanikau area, where it could receive the maximum support from 17th Army artillery. The 17th Army, however, did land a small force at Koli Point in early November to deliver supplies to some of Shoji's troops who had retreated there after the October disaster. Orders directing these forces to build an airfield on the flat plain south of Koli Point were also issued. A part of the 230th Infantry of the 38th Division had already landed on Guadalcanal in October and on 2 to 3 November, and the Tokyo Express landed elements of the 228th Infantry along the beaches from Kokumbona to Cape Esperance between 28 October and 8 November. Japanese naval units assembled in the harbours between Buin and Rabaul during the first days of November. By 12 November, Allied reconnaissance planes reported that 2 aircraft carriers, 4 battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, and 30 destroyers, besides transports and cargo ships, had been assembled. There were 60 vessels in the Buinfesi-Tonele anchorages alone, but there was to be one vital difference between the October and November counteroffensives. The Japanese, who had previously been using their aircraft carriers with some success, did not commit them to action in November. American naval forces, though still inferior in number to those of the Japanese, were again to prove their effectiveness. 24 submarines had been patrolling the Tokyo Express routes and had destroyed or damaged a number of Japanese ships. Besides the submarines, the naval forces under Halsey's command included the aircraft carrier Enterprise, 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 1 light anti-aircraft cruiser, 22 destroyers, and 7 transports and cargo ships, organized into 2 task forces. Because the lack of gasoline at Henderson Field was limiting the operations of B-17s, Admiral Halsey requested the Southwest Pacific Air Forces to bomb shipping around Buin, Tonelay, and Fazy between 11 and 14 November, as well as to reconnoiter the approaches to Guadalcanal. Beginning on 10 November, South Pacific land-based aircraft, including those at Henderson Field, were to cover the northern and western approaches and to protect the Lunga area. The plans for the land-based aircraft of the South Pacific did not assign to them new missions, but restated their continuing missions in specific terms. On Guadalcanal, the situation was more hopeful than it had been in October. Pistol Pete could no longer shell the airfields with impunity. The arrival on 2 November of the 155mm guns of F Battery, 244th Coast Artillery Battalion, and the battery of the 5th Defence Battalion had provided effective counter-battery artillery. Less than 4 hours after it had begun debarkation at Lunga Point, F Battery of the 244th was in action against Pistol Pete. Troop strength had increased with the addition of the 8th Marines on 4 November, and still more reinforcements were expected soon. The addition of more New Zealand troops and of the first elements of the 43rd United States Division to the South Pacific Force had made it possible to relieve the American Division of its mission of defending New Caledonia. The complete division was to be committed to Guadalcanal, where one of its regiments, the 164th Infantry, was already engaged. The next American Division unit to be shipped to Guadalcanal was the 182nd Regimental Combat Team, less the 3rd Battalion, which was still in the New Hebrides. The movement of this unit to Guadalcanal by Turner's task force was to be a larger operation than the dispatch of the Aola Bay Force and the 8th Marines. One of the 2 South Pacific Naval Task Forces, under command of Admiral Turner, was charged with the dual responsibility of defending Guadalcanal and of transporting troops and supplies to the island. Admiral Kincaid's carrier task force at Noumea was available to support Turner's force. These forces, though limited in numbers, had to stop the Japanese unless the United States Navy was to be driven out of the Solomons. Turner's task force was organized into 3 groups. 3 transports, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers under Admiral Scott constituted one group. Scott's ships were to carry marines, ammunition, and rations from Espiritu Santo to Guadalcanal. Admiral Callahan commanded the second group of 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers, which were to operate out of Espiritu Santo and cover the movement of the third group from Noumea to Guadalcanal. Admiral Turner assumed direct command of the third group, consisting of 4 transports which were to transfer the 182nd Regimental Combat Team less the 3rd Battalion, Marine replacements, naval personnel, and ammunition from Noumea to Guadalcanal. Admiral Kincaid's force at Noumea, consisting of the carrier Enterprise, 2 battleships, 2 cruisers, and 8 destroyers, was to support Turner's force. In addition, all aircraft in the South Pacific were to cover the movement of Turner's ships and to strike at any approaching Japanese vessels. Turner expected that a Japanese invasion fleet would soon be approaching Guadalcanal. He planned to land the 182nd Infantry at Lunga Point and move the transports out of danger before the enemy could arrive. The ships under his direct command sailed from Noumea at 1500 hours, 8 November. The next day, Scott's group left Espiritu Santo. Callahan's warships followed on 10 November. Callahan's and Turner's groups rendezvoused off San Cristobal the next morning. Scott's group arrived off Guadalcanal at 5:30 a.m. on 11 November. The Xylin, Libra, and Betelgeuse began unloading but were interrupted twice during the day by enemy bombers which damaged all 3 ships. At 1800 hours, the group withdrew to Indispensable Strait. Damage to the Xylin was found to be serious, and with 1 destroyer as escort she returned to Espiritu Santo. Scott's warships at 2200 hours joined Callahan's group, which had been preceding the advance of Turner's transports. The Libra and Betelgeuse later joined Turner's group. The warships, under Callahan's command, then swept the waters around Savo Island and remained in Sealark Channel for the rest of the night of 11-12 November. The transports anchored off Lunga Point at 5:30 a.m., 12 November. Covered by the warships, they began discharging troops and cargo. A Japanese shore battery in the vicinity of Kokumbona opened fire on the Betelgeuse and Libra at 7:18 a.m., but missed. It ceased firing when 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and counter-battery artillery on shore replied. About 25 enemy torpedo bombers attacked in the afternoon and forced the ships to cease unloading and get underway. The cruiser San Francisco, which was Callahan's flagship, and the destroyer Buchanan were damaged, but the transports were not hit, and all but one bomber were shot down. The transports re-anchored at 15:25, having been forced to halt unloading for 2 hours. At 10:35 on the same morning, American planes patrolling north of Maleta sighted a Japanese force, including 2 battleships, sailing south toward Guadalcanal. A convoy of transports carrying the 38th Division troops, replacements, and naval troops followed farther to the north. By late afternoon, Admiral Turner had concluded that 90% of the supplies carried by the ships under his direct command could be unloaded that day, but that several more days would be required to unload the Betelgeuse and Libra. To avoid destruction by the enemy battleships, he decided to withdraw all the cargo ships and transports. The warships were to remain to engage the approaching enemy. The cargo ships and transports, escorted by destroyers, withdrew at 18:15, November 12th. Callahan's and Scott's warships preceded them to Indispensable Strait, then reversed their course and returned to protect Guadalcanal. The Macaulay and the President Jackson had been completely unloaded. 80% of the President Adams cargo had been landed, 50% of the Crescent Cities, 40% of the Betelgeuses, and 20% of the Libras. All the troops, numbering about 6,000 men, had debarked. The forces which had been landed by Scott's group consisted of the 1st Marine Aviation Engineer Battalion, ground crews of the 1st Marine Air Wing, and Marine replacements. Turner's ships had landed 1,300 Marine replacements, 372 naval personnel, L Battery, 11th Marines comprising 155mm howitzers, some 164th Infantry casuals, and the 182nd Infantry Regimental Combat Team. The combat team was made up of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 182nd Infantry, the 245th Field Artillery Battalion with 105mm howitzers, plus engineer, medical, quartermaster, and ordnance personnel 3,358 men. The Japanese force, which had been sighted, consisted of the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, 1 light cruiser, and 15 destroyers. This force had orders to enter Sea Lark Channel and neutralize the airfields on Guadalcanal by bombardment. Once enough aircraft and supplies had been destroyed, and the airfield pitted, Japanese troops could be transported to Guadalcanal in safety. The fact that the battleships carried high explosive ammunition for bombarding the airfield, instead of armor-piercing shells, reduced the margin of superiority of their 14-inch guns in the ensuing battle, for the battleship's shells did not always penetrate the cruiser's armor plate. This was fortunate, for to withstand the enemy force, Admiral Callahan had only 2 8-inch gun cruisers, 1 6-inch gun cruiser, 2 light anti-aircraft cruisers, and 8 destroyers. Callahan led his light forces towards Savo after dark to engage the battleships. At 1:24 a.m. on 13 November, Helena's radar located Japanese ships 27,000 yards away, between Savo and Cape Esperance. A warning was immediately transmitted to the flagship San Francisco, but the cruiser's search radar was inadequate. As a result, Admiral Callahan, like Admiral Scott at Cape Esperance 1 month earlier, did not know the exact location of either his own or the enemy ships. The American destroyers closed to short range to fire torpedoes. The vans of the opposing forces intermingled, and the American column penetrated the Japanese formation. The Japanese illuminated the American cruisers, then opened fire at 1:48 a.m. The outnumbered Americans replied, firing to port and starboard. The American column became disorganized as destroyers maneuvered to fire torpedoes, and both cruisers and destroyers swerved off their courses to avoid collisions. The engagement became a melee in which the desperate American ships engaged the enemy individually. In the confusion, both sides occasionally fired on their own vessels. As far as they could, the American ships concentrated their fire on the battleship Hiei. Admiral Scott, aboard the Atlanta, was annihilated by fire from a cruiser. Later, a salvo from the Hiei struck the San Francisco and annihilated, among others, Admiral Callahan, and mortally wounded her commanding officer, Captain Cassin Young. The San Francisco continued to engage the Hiei as long as her main battery would bear. The Hiei fired several salvos, then ceased. The San Francisco, having received 15 major hits from heavy guns, withdrew. The Atlanta caught fire, and several American destroyers blew up. But about 3 a.m., the Japanese abandoned their attempt to break through the tenacious American force and retired northward. 2 Japanese destroyers had been sunk, and 4 were damaged. The gallantry of the light American forces in this desperate action had saved Henderson Field from a battleship bombardment, but the cost was heavy. Of the 13 American ships, 12 had been either sunk or damaged. The anti-aircraft cruisers Atlanta and Juno, and the destroyers Barton, Cushing, Laffey, and Monson sank in the Channel. The heavy cruisers San Francisco and Portland, and the destroyers Aaron Ward, O'Bannon, and Sterrett, which all had suffered serious damage, retired with the two other surviving ships toward Espiritu Santo during the morning of 13 November. The battleship Kirishima had escaped, but at daylight on 13 November, American Air Forces located the battleship Hiei near Savo. Crippled and on fire, she was cruising slowly in circles. The Hiei, the principal American target, had been struck 85 times in the battle and was out of control. Planes from Henderson Field attacked her steadily all day, and on the night of 14 November she was scuttled by her crew. Meanwhile, Admiral Kincaid had led his carrier task force from Noumea toward Guadalcanal. At daylight on 14 November, search planes from the Enterprise sighted a group of Japanese cruisers near New Georgia. These ships belonged to a second Japanese force, which, consisting of 3 heavy and 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers from the Outer South Seas Supporting Unit of the 8th Fleet, had entered Sea Lark Channel early on the morning of 14 November. When American motor torpedo boats sortied from Tulagi, the Japanese retired without having inflicted much damage to Henderson Field. Later, when the search planes found this force, aircraft from Guadalcanal and from the carrier attacked it and sank 1 heavy cruiser and damaged 1 heavy and 1 light cruiser and a destroyer. After these attacks, the planes from the Enterprise flew to Guadalcanal to operate temporarily from Henderson Field. This permitted the Enterprise, the only remaining carrier in the South Pacific, to withdraw to the south, out of range of hostile aircraft. Disregarding the fact that the American airfields on Guadalcanal were still in operation, the Japanese determined to bring the troop convoy to Guadalcanal. On 14 November, it left the waters near northern New Georgia, where it had been standing by since 13 November, to sail southward down the slot. Consisting of 11 transports and cargo ships and 12 escorting destroyers, this convoy was the largest the Japanese had yet employed in the Solomons. The ships carried about 10,000 troops of the 229th and 230th Regiments of the 38th Division, artillerymen, engineers, replacement units, a naval force of between 1,000 and 3,500 men, weapons, and 10,000 tons of supplies. The Japanese had not committed aircraft carriers to close support of operations, and the convoy's air cover was weak. A Southwest Pacific patrol plane lending support to the South Pacific discovered the convoy at 8:30 a.m. 14 November, about 150 miles from Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal aircraft and the Enterprise Air Group made ready to attack with torpedoes, bombs, and machine guns. Ground crews servicing the planes rolled bombs across the muddy runways, lifted them into the bays, and fueled the planes entirely by hand. The planes took off and struck the transports continuously throughout the day with outstanding success. They hit 9 transports. 7 sank at sea, and the 4 remaining afloat sailed on toward Guadalcanal under cover of darkness. Strengthened and reorganized, the heavy bombardment force which had fought the American cruisers on the night of 12-13 November turned back toward Guadalcanal to cover the approach of the transports. It consisted of the battleship Kirishima, 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. To combat this force and to attack any surviving transports, Admiral Halsey sent the battleships Washington and South Dakota and 4 destroyers from Kincaid's force to the north. Under the command of Rear Admiral Willis A. Lee, Jr., the 2 battleships and 4 destroyers passed the southeastern tip of Guadalcanal about noon on 14 November. Shortly before midnight, they entered the channel. As the Washington neared Savo in the darkness at 12:01 a.m. 15 November, her radar located an enemy ship. The Washington opened fire at 12:16 a.m. at a range of 18,500 yards, and the South Dakota and the destroyers entered the action immediately thereafter. The Japanese fought back vigorously, but by 1:42 a.m. the long-range gunfight in the narrow waters had ended. It was one of the few engagements between battleships of the entire war. The Japanese retired northward, having again failed to hit the airfields. The badly damaged Kirishima was scuttled by her crew. 1 Japanese destroyer sank. 3 of the American destroyers sank, and the South Dakota and the other destroyer suffered damage. When day broke on 15 November, the Americans saw, lying at Tassafaronga in plain view, the 4 surviving transports of the force which had been hit the day before. The transports had no air cover. 3 were beached and unloading, while the 4th was slowly pulling northward toward Doma Reef. F Battery of the 244th Coast Artillery Battalion had moved 2 of its guns from their field artillery positions on the west bank of the Lunga to the beach. These guns opened fire at 5 o'clock and hit 1 beached transport 19,500 yards away. The ship began to burn. The 3rd Defence Battalion's 5-inch batteries opened fire 45 minutes later on a second ship 15,800 yards away and hit her repeatedly. The beach target burned and listed to port. The destroyer Meade sailed over from Tulagi to shell both the ships and the landing areas, while aircraft from Henderson Field and bombers from Espiritu Santo attacked the remaining ships. By noon, all 4 had been turned into burning, useless hulks which were abandoned to rust in the shallow water. The planes then turned their attention to the Japanese supplies which had been landed and started tremendous fires among the piles of material. One blaze was 1,000 yards long. Of the ill-fated convoy's 10,000 or more troops, about 4,000 had landed safely on Guadalcanal, but without sufficient supplies and rations. Only 5 tons of the 10,000 tons of supplies aboard the ships were landed safely. Of the rest of the troops, some had drowned at sea, but a large number were rescued by the Japanese. The destruction of the convoy brought the November counter-offensive to a quick end. For the Japanese, the failure had been expensive. Besides the troops and supplies lost at sea, they had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 3 destroyers sunk. Equally serious had been the destruction of the 11 ships in the convoy, a total loss of 77,609 shipping tons. 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers had been damaged. The United States Navy had lost 1 light cruiser, 2 light anti-aircraft cruisers, and 7 destroyers sunk, and 1 battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, and 4 destroyers damaged. This was the last major effort by the Japanese Army and Navy to recapture the Lunga area by a coordinated attack. The November battle had made the task of reinforcing Guadalcanal much less dangerous. The movement of the 182nd Infantry was the last shipment of troops to Guadalcanal in the face of enemy forces. Thereafter, American troops were to be landed on Guadalcanal fairly regularly, and although enemy air attacks continued, and the Alciba was torpedoed by a submarine on 28 November, the danger of attack by enemy warships lessened. The Lunga area was now securely held, for by the end of November, Vandegrift's force totaled 39,416 men. The November battle had been the most decisive engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. It had almost sealed off the Japanese on the Guadalcanal battlefields from their rear bases. After November, the most important factor of the campaign was to be the long, hard ground fighting on the island itself. In November, General Vandegrift had been able to resume the attempt to extend the western line beyond Kokumbona. The 17th Army had been decisively defeated in October and was unable to mount another counter-offensive until it could receive strong reinforcements. More American troops and planes were soon to be sent to Guadalcanal, and the offensive could be resumed with good prospects of ultimate success. The first offensive move was begun before the mid-November naval battle. The objectives were about the same as those of the marine offensive which opened on 7 October 1st, the trail junction and landing beaches at Kokumbona, over 8,000 yards west of the Matanikau, and second, the Poha River, about 2,600 yards beyond Kokumbona. Once the Poha River line had been gained, the Lunga airfields would be safe from enemy artillery fire. The infantry forces selected for the attack were the 5th Marines, the 2nd Marines less the 3rd Battalion, and the Whaling Group, which now consisted of the Scout Sniper Detachment and the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Supporting the offensive were to be the 11th Marines and attached Army artillery battalions, aircraft, engineers, and a boat detachment from the Kokum Naval Base. The infantry forces were to attack west in column of regiments on a 1,500-yard front from the Matanikau River, the line of departure. The 5th Marines, closely followed by the 2nd Marines in reserve, would make the attack. The Whaling Group would move out along the high grassy ridges on the left, south of the attack forces to protect the left flank. Colonel Edson was to command the attacking force. The time for the attack was set for 6:30 a.m. 1 November. Full use was to be made of supporting artillery and mortar fire. The 11th Marines and attached battalions were to mass fire first in front of the 5th Marines. Artillery and mortar fire were to be placed on each objective and on each ravine and stream approached by the infantry. At least 2 battalions of artillery were to fire at targets as far west as the Poha, displacing their howitzers forward as the need arose. Aircraft were to strike enemy troop concentrations and artillery positions. Spotting planes for the division artillery would be furnished by the 1st Marine Air Wing. On the night before the attack, the 1st Engineer Battalion was to construct footbridges across the Matanikau and an additional bridge suitable for vehicles on the day of the attack. The Naval Boat Detachment was to provide boats for amphibious supply and evacuation as the troops advanced up the coast. In preparation for the attack, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 2nd Marines were brought to Guadalcanal from Tulagi. The 3rd Battalion, which had served as Division Mobile Reserve for 6 weeks, was sent to Tulagi to rest. The 5th Marines moved to the forward Matanikau position to relieve the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, and the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Responsibility for the 5th Marines' old sector in the perimeter defense was assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines. Detachments from the heavy weapons companies of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, and from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, remained in position along the Matanikau to cover the attacking forces as they made the crossing on 1 November. The 2nd Marines, less the 3rd Battalion, meanwhile moved into bivouac east of the Matanikau River. The engineers salvaged and prepared material for the bridges between 25 and 31 October. On the afternoon of 31 October, they hauled the material to the east bank of the river. Early on the morning of 1 November, E Company of the 5th Marines crossed the river to outpost the west bank in order to cover the troops constructing the bridges. Between 1 o'clock and 6 o'clock, 1 November, A, C, and D companies of the 1st Engineer Battalion laid 3 footbridges over the river. Each bridge had a 40-inch wide treadway, which was supported by 2x4-inch stringers, lashed to a light framework which in turn was lashed to floating fuel drums. At daybreak on 1 November, the 11th Marines, assisted by the 3rd Defense Battalion's 5-inch guns, fired the preliminary bombardment. The cruisers San Francisco and Helena and the destroyer Sterret had been sent up by Admiral Halsey, and they shelled the areas west of Point Cruz. P-39s and SBDs from Henderson Field struck Japanese artillery positions, while 19 B-17s from Espiritu Santo dropped 335 100-pound bombs on Kokumbona. When the artillery fire lifted, the 3 battalions of the 5th Marines started across the Matanikau bridges. By 7 a.m., the move had been completed successfully, and the 1st and 2nd Battalions, on the right and left respectively, deployed to the attack. Their left was covered by the Whaling Group, which had crossed the river farther upstream. The 1st Battalion of the 5th, advancing over the flat ground along the beach, met the heaviest opposition as the Japanese, yielding ground slowly and reluctantly, fought a delaying action. The 2nd Battalion, moving over higher ground, pushed ahead rapidly and lost contact with the 1st shortly after 12:30. The advancing forces halted for the night short of Point Cruz, having gained slightly more than 1,000 yards in the day's action. During the day, the engineers, using a 10-ton temporary pier, had put a vehicular bridge across the Matanikau about 500 yards from the mouth. Although completed that day, the bridge could not be used until the following afternoon, when a new road from the coast road to the bridge was completed. The next morning, Colonel Edson committed the reserve 3rd Battalion to assist the 1st Battalion on the right, while the 2nd Battalion, having advanced beyond Point Cruz, turned to the right to envelop the enemy by attacking northward. By 10:42, the 2nd Battalion had reached the beach west of the point and trapped the Japanese who were still opposing the 1st and 3rd Battalions. During the afternoon of 2 November, the 2 battalions of the 2nd Marines passed by on the left of the 5th Marines to continue the westward push the next day. On 3 November, the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, and the Whaling Group, which had continued its advance inland, led the attack. The 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, and the 1st Battalion, 164th Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Frank C. Richards commanding, which had been ordered forward from its positions on the Ilu River, were in reserve. Meanwhile, the 5th Marines successfully reduced the pocket at Point Cruz. The regiment annihilated about 350 Japanese and captured 12 37mm guns, 1 field piece, and 34 machine guns. In the final phases of the mop-up, the 5th Marines delivered 3 successful bayonet attacks and drove the surviving Japanese into the sea. After the reduction of the pocket, the 5th Marines and the Whaling Group were ordered back to the Lunga area, and Colonel Arthur, commanding the 2nd Marines, took over tactical direction of the offensive from Colonel Edson. The next day, the 1st Battalion of the 164th Infantry and the 2nd Marines, less the 3rd Battalion, resumed the advance. By afternoon, they had moved forward against the retreating Japanese to a point about 2,000 yards west of Point Cruz, or about 4,000 yards short of Kokumbona. At that point, Division Headquarters halted the advance. Enemy troops had landed east of the perimeter defense, and there could be no further westward movement until the threat had been removed. At 1500 hours, the 3 battalions dug in at Point Cruz to hold part of the ground they had gained. Division Headquarters had been expecting a Japanese landing in early November at Koli Point east of the Lunga perimeter. To forestall the attempt, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines, Lieutenant Colonel H. Hannikin commanding, had been ordered out of the Lunga perimeter to make a forced march to the Matanikau River, about 13 miles east of the Lunga. By nightfall of 2 November, when the 5th Marines had reduced the Point Cruz pocket, the battalion had established defensive positions east of the Matapona's mouth, near the village of Tetere. About 2200 hours on 2 November, the silhouettes of one Japanese cruiser, one transport, and 3 destroyers appeared offshore in the rainy darkness to land supplies, and about 1,500 soldiers from the 230th Infantry at Gavaga Creek, about 1 mile east of Colonel Hannikin's position. Hyakutake had ordered these troops, with ammunition and provisions for 2,000 men, to land, join Shoji's force in the vicinity of Koli Point, and build an airfield. By the time the Japanese were landing, Colonel Hannikin's radio communication had failed, and he was unable to inform division headquarters of his situation. The next morning the Japanese force moved west. The Marine Battalion engaged the enemy and was hit by artillery and mortar fire. When one Japanese unit pushed southwest to outflank the Marines, the battalion, fighting as it went, withdrew slowly westward along the coast, crossed the Nalimbu, and took a stronger position on the west bank. Colonel Hannikin, whose troops were running short of food, attempted to radio information about his situation to division headquarters, but was not able to get his message through until 1445. When headquarters received Hannikin's message, arrangements for support and reinforcement were quickly completed. Aircraft from the Lunga airfields bombed and strafed enemy positions, but as no targets were visible from the air, results were probably insignificant. The cruisers San Francisco and Helena and the destroyers Sterett and Lansdowne, which had been supporting the Kokumbona attack, sailed eastward to shell Koli Point. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, with the regimental commander Colonel Amor L. Sims, immediately embarked on landing craft to reinforce the 2nd Battalion at Koli Point. The 164th Infantry less, the 1st Battalion, was ordered out of its positions along the Ilu to march east to a point about 4,000 yards south of the 7th Marines at Koli Point to be in position to envelop the Japanese left, south flank. General Rupertus, Assistant Commander of the 1st Marine Division, took command of the Koli Point operation, his first tactical experience on Guadalcanal. On 4 November, the day on which the Kokumbona attack was halted, the Lunga Perimeter Command was reorganized. General Rupertus was transferred from the relative quiet of Tulagi to Guadalcanal. The Lunga area was divided into 2 separate sectors, one east of the Lunga and one west of the river. General Rupertus took the east sector. Brigadier General Edmund B. Sabri, Assistant Commander of the American Division, who had just landed on the island to prepare for the arrival of the remainder of his division, took the west sector. Both generals reported directly to division headquarters, which thus operated as a small corps headquarters. On 4 November, General Rupertus and regimental headquarters and the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines reached Koli Point. The 164th Infantry less, the 1st Battalion and B Company of the 8th Marines left the Ilu River line at 6 o'clock to march to their objective about 7 miles to the east. General Sebri accompanied the 164th to gain close experience with jungle warfare. At the same time, 1st Marine Division headquarters issued orders to the 2nd Raider Battalion, which had just landed at Aola Bay with the 147th Infantry, to advance overland toward Koli Point to intercept any Japanese detachments moving eastward. The 164th Infantry progressed slowly on its inland march, through swampy jungles and hot stretches of high kunai grass. As there were no inland roads, trucks carried some supplies along the coast to Koli Point, but inland the soldiers of the 164th Infantry, wearing full combat equipment, had to hand-carry all their weapons and ammunition. It was noon before the regiment reached the 1st Assembly area on the west bank of the Nalimbu River. While regimental headquarters and the 3rd Battalion bivouacked for the night, the 2nd Battalion advanced northward in column of companies along the west bank of the Nalimbu. After advancing about 2,000 yards, the 2nd Battalion bivouacked. It had not established contact with the 7th Marines. Patrols had met only a few small Japanese units. On the following morning, 5 November, General Rupertus ordered the 164th Infantry less, the 1st Battalion, to cross to the east bank of the Nalimbu, and then to advance north to Koli Point, to destroy the Japanese facing the 7th Marines at Koli Point. The 3rd Battalion crossed the flooded Nalimbu about 3,500 yards south of Koli Point, then swung north to advance along the east bank. Again, no large organized enemy force appeared. The battalion advanced against occasional rifle and machine gun fire. Machine gun fire halted 2 platoons of G Company for a time until American artillery and mortar fire silenced the enemy guns. The 2nd Battalion of the 164th Infantry, which had withdrawn to the south from its bivouac positions, followed on the right and rear of the 3rd Battalion. Action on 6 November was indecisive. The 7th Marines crossed the flooded Nalimbiu with difficulty, while the 164th Infantry's battalions moved slowly through the jungle. The 3rd Battalion found an abandoned Japanese bivouac about 1,000 yards south of Koli Point, but the enemy had escaped to the east. The 3rd Battalion reached Koli Point at night on 6 November and was followed by the 2nd Battalion the next morning. During the night of 5 to 6 November, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, mistaking each other for the enemy, exchanged shots. Regimental headquarters and the anti-tank and E companies of the 164th Infantry, together with B Company of the 8th Marines, followed a more circuitous route and reached Koli Point later in the morning. The combined force then advanced eastward to a point about 1 mile west of the wide mouth of the Matanikau River. Again, there was no enemy resistance, possibly because the Japanese were preparing defences east of the Matanikau to permit the main body to escape. The Americans dug in to defend the beach west of the Matanikau against an expected landing on the night of 7 to 8 November, but it failed to materialize. On 8 November, the 2nd Battalion of the 164th Infantry was attached to the 7th Marines and placed in reserve. To surround the Japanese, who had dug in along Gavaga Creek at Tetere, about 1 mile east of the Matanikau, the 3 battalions left their positions west of the wide, swampy mouth of the Matanikau and advanced to the east and west of Gavaga Creek. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, occupied the west bank and took positions running inland from the beach. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, was posted on the east to hold a shorter line between the east bank of Gavaga Creek and the beach. When dengue fever put General Rupertus out of action on 8 November, General Sebri took command on orders from Vandegrift. With the Japanese force located and surrounded, the size of the American force at Koli Point could be safely reduced. Since General Vandegrift desired to commit a large part of the 164th Infantry to the attack against Kokumbona, regimental headquarters, the anti-tank company, and the 3rd Battalion of the 164th Infantry and B Company of the 8th Marines were brought back to the Lunga perimeter by boat and truck on 9 November. On that day, at Koli Point, the 2nd Battalion less E Company of the 164th Infantry took positions on the right of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. During the night, E Company was committed to the left flank of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines. The Americans now held a curved line from the beach around a horseshoe bend in Gavaga Creek. The Japanese, blocked on the east and west, repeatedly attempted to break out of the trap. They used machine guns, mortars, and hand grenades in their attempts to drive the Americans back. One gap in the American lines remained open in the south, for F and E companies of the 164th, which were separated by the swampy creek, had failed to make contact. Although wounded 7 times by mortar shell fragments, Colonel Puller remained in command of the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines. The Marines and soldiers, supported by 155mm gun batteries, 2 75mm pack howitzer batteries, and aircraft, began to reduce the pocket. The Japanese resisted vigorously with grenades, mortars, automatic weapons, and small arms. On 10 November, F Company of the 164th Infantry attempted to close the gap and join flanks with E Company. The attempt failed, and the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 164th was relieved. On the next day, G Company drove east to close the gap. As the Marine battalions closed in from the east and west, the 2nd Battalion of the 164th Infantry pushed north to reach the beaches in the late afternoon of 11 November. By 12 November, the pocket had been entirely cleared. About 40 Americans had been annihilated, 120 wounded, 450 Japanese had been annihilated. The captured material included, besides stores of rations and 50 collapsible landing boats, General Kawaguchi's personal effects. Yakutake apparently abandoned the idea of building an airfield near Koli Point, for he ordered Shoji's troops to return via the inland route to Kokumbona. Some of the Japanese had escaped through the gap between the two companies, and some others had apparently withdrawn inland about 7 November. These forces, retreating south and west toward Mount Austin, were harried by Lieutenant Colonel Evans F. Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion, which had marched west from Aola Bay. The Raiders, in a remarkable 30-day march outside the American lines, covered 150 miles, fought 12 separate actions, and annihilated over 400 enemy soldiers at a cost of only 17 raiders annihilated, before they finally entered the Lunga perimeter on 4 December. Of the estimated 1,500 Japanese soldiers who may have landed at Koli Point, probably less than half survived to rejoin the main forces at Mount Austin and the hills to the west. On 10 November, with the trapping of the Japanese at Koli Point, it became possible to renew the westward offensive toward Kokumbona. Under Colonel Arthur's command, the 1st Battalion of the 164th Infantry, the newly arrived 8th Marines, and the 2nd Marines less the 3rd Battalion moved west from Point Cruz on 10 November. Supported by fire from the 1st, 3rd and 5th Battalions of the 11th Marines, the composite force executed a frontal attack on a 3-battalion front. The 1st Battalion, 164th Infantry, advanced on the right along the beach. The 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, advanced in the centre, and the 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines, was echeloned to the left and rear in the attack. On 11 November, the advance was resumed against rifle, machine gun and mortar fire. By noon, the troops had fought their way to a point slightly beyond that which they had reached on 4 November. The Japanese were grimly determined to prevent the Americans from taking Kokumbona. This village was the site of the 17th Army Command Post, and also the terminus of the main supply trail to the positions which the Japanese were secretly preparing on Mount Austin. Accordingly, Hyakutake assigned the mission of halting the American attack to a new general, Major General Takeo Ito, infantry group commander of the 38th Division and a veteran of the fighting in China. Ito had landed at Tasafarunga from a destroyer on 5 November to take command of a reserve force of 5,000 men. Believing that the American front west of Point Cruz was so narrow that he could easily outflank it, he moved his force to a concealed position in the jungled hills on the left flank of the Americans, about 5,000 yards south of the beach. From this point, he planned to strike the American left flank and rear. Before Ito could attack, and before the Americans were even aware that their left was in danger, Vandergrift was once more forced to halt the offensive when he received word that the Japanese were preparing to bring large troop convoys to Guadalcanal in mid-November. To meet the threat of another counter-offensive, all troops were needed within the Lunga perimeter. The battalions disengaged. The 2nd and 8th Marines retired toward the Matanikau, covered by the 1st Battalion of the 164th Infantry. The Marines recrossed the Matanikau on 11 November, followed next day by the Army Battalion. The entire 164th Infantry, having returned from its operations across the Matanikau and Metapona rivers, went into division reserve. Once safely across the Matanikau, the Americans destroyed the bridges and held their lines while the air and naval forces fought desperately to keep the Japanese away. As a result of the naval victory in mid-November and the arrival of the 182nd Infantry, commanded by Colonel Daniel W. Point Hogan, the offensive toward Kokumbona and the Poha rivers was resumed. The 1st Marine Division headquarters, which ordered the attack, placed General Sebri, commander of the western sector, in tactical command. Available troops in the west sector included the 164th Infantry, the 8th Marines, and the 2 battalions of the 182nd Infantry. To support operations in any direction, all artillery battalions remained grouped within the perimeter under Del Valle's command. General Sebri planned first to gain a line of departure far enough west of the Matanikau and far enough south of the beach to provide sufficient room for the regiments to maneuver. Once the line of departure had been gained, a full-scale offensive could be opened. The line which General Sebri planned to capture first ran about 2,500 yards inland from Point Cruz to the southernmost point, Hills 66 of a 1,700-yard-long ridge, Hills 66, 80, 180. It was thought that the west bank of the Matanikau was not occupied by the Japanese during the second week of November. This belief was confirmed by infantry and aerial reconnaissance patrols, and General Sebri and Colonel Whaling of the Marines personally patrolled the ground as far west as Point Cruz without meeting any Japanese. Once the line of departure had been gained, the attack units were to move west, followed by the 1st Marines on the inland flank. The latter regiment was to turn northward to envelop any Japanese pockets, as the 5th Marines had done so successfully earlier in the month, while the attack units continued to advance westward. This part of the plan was cancelled when the 1st Marine Division was alerted for departure from Guadalcanal. The 2nd Battalion of the 182nd Infantry was to cross the Matanikau on 18 November to seize Hill 66, the highest ground north of the northwest Matanikau Fork, and the 1st Battalion of the 182nd Infantry would advance across the river and west to Point Cruz the next day. As the American forces which had withdrawn on 11-12 November had destroyed all the Matanikau bridges, Engineers were to bridge the river, improve the coast road, and build a trail over the ridges to Hill 66. The terrain west of the Matanikau differs from the deep jungles of the inland areas. The coast is flat and sandy. South of the beach, rocky ridges, covered with brush and coarse grass, thrust upward to heights of several hundred feet. These ridges, running from north to south, rise near the beach and increase in height toward the south. Between these steep ridges are deep, jungled ravines which the Japanese could exploit to good advantage. The ridgeline formed by hills 80, 81, and 66 faces northwest and turns sharply eastward at Hill 66 toward the Matanikau River's main stream. It is separated from the high hills on the south by the valley cut by the northwest Matanikau Fork. Unknown to the Americans, the 17th Army had also been planning for local offensive action. While the shattered 2nd Division assembled near Kokumbona, the 38th Division had been ordered to advance east from Kokumbona, cross the Matanikau, and seize the high ground on the east bank for artillery positions and as a line of departure for another attack against the Lunga airfields. At the same time, troops under Ito's command had been ordered to occupy Mount Austin. On 18 November, the 2nd Battalion of the 182nd Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Bernard B. Twombly commanding, covered by the 8th Marines on the east bank of the Matanikau, crossed a footbridge about 700 yards from the Matanikau's mouth to seize Hill 66. The battalion climbed to the top of the first ridge on the west bank, Hill 75, and advanced southwest behind the ridge crest toward Hill 66, about 2,000 yards from Hill 75. There were no Japanese on the ridges, but the inexperienced battalion made slow progress. The men, having landed only 6 days before, were not yet accustomed to the moist heat. Since landing, most of them had been unloading ships and moving their supplies. They carried full loads of ammunition, water, and food. Many who had not swallowed salt tablets collapsed, exhausted from the hard climb. The 2nd Battalion did not reach Hill 66 until noon. Having taken the objective, the men dug foxholes and gun emplacements on the west and south military crests of Hill 66. On the left was G Company, and F on the right. Battalion Reserve consisted of E Company, and H Company put its mortars in a gully behind the battalion command post. In the afternoon, a detail of 2 officers and 30 enlisted men from G Company went into the valley on the south to fill canteens at a waterhole. They reached the spring safely, but failed to post sentries as they filled the clanking canteens. As one man in the group glanced up, he saw a Japanese officer and about 20 soldiers deploying in the jungle nearby. The Japanese promptly opened fire. The water detail scattered, each man taking cover as best he could. When a rescue party from the 2nd Battalion later made its way to the spring, the enemy patrol withdrew and the water party straggled back to the crest of Hill 66. 1 officer and 1 enlisted man had been annihilated. There were no more encounters with the Japanese that day. The 1st Battalion of the 182nd Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis F. McGowan, crossed the Matanikau the next morning on 19 November. The battalion advanced along the flat ground between the northernmost hills and the beach, while B Company of the 8th Marines, acting on Sebri's orders, advanced over the most northerly hill, the Hill 78, to cover the battalion's left flank. About 400 yards west of the river, the battalion met fire from small enemy groups, but there was no heavy fighting. The battalion moved slowly and cautiously, fighting a series of skirmishes as it moved toward Point Cruz. B Company of the 8th Marines also met enemy fire west of Point Cruz and withdrew to the vicinity of Hill 78 to take cover. The company again attempted to advance, but could not gain ground. About noon, Colonel McGowan's battalion halted just east of Point Cruz. It dug in along a 700-yard line from the beach east of the point to the west tip of Hill 78, refusing the left flank eastward a short distance along the south slopes of the hill. The Marine Company then withdrew across the Matanikau to rejoin its regiment. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 182nd Infantry were then separated by a gap of over 1,000 yards. Japanese troops had been secretly moving east from Kokumbona. These forces took positions west of the 1st Battalion during the night of 19-20 November, while artillery and mortars fired on the American lines. About dawn on 20 November, part of this force struck suddenly at the 1st Battalion's left flank. The troops holding high ground on the battalion's left held their line, but as the attack developed along the 1st Battalion's line, the troops on the low ground fell back about 400 yards. General Sebri, Lieutenant Colonel Paul A. Gavin, the operations officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Daly, the assistant intelligence officer of the American Division, came forward and found the battalion somewhat shaken. They halted the withdrawal and reorganized the companies. Planes and artillery then struck at the Japanese, who had not exploited their advantage by advancing east of Point Cruz, and the 1st Battalion again moved west and by 9 o'clock had regained its position. C and A companies of the 182nd attacked west after the recapture of the initial line and advanced to the beach just west of Point Cruz. There the attack stalled after the companies had been hit hard by Japanese artillery and mortar fire. There was considerable confusion and some straggling in the 182nd Infantry, and it was only after order had been restored that the 1st Battalion organized a disciplined firing line. The Japanese retained Point Cruz itself. By afternoon on 20 November, it had become obvious that more American troops were needed west of the Matanikau. The Japanese were known to be moving more troops forward into the engagement. General Sebri therefore ordered the more experienced 164th Infantry out of reserve to fill the gap between the 2 battalions of the 182nd Infantry. The 164th Infantry was to enter the line under cover of darkness and attack the next morning. The 1st Battalion of the 164th Infantry entered the line on the left of the 1st Battalion of the 182nd Infantry, and the 3rd Battalion of the 164th moved in between the 2nd Battalion, 182nd Infantry, and the 1st Battalion, 164th. Each battalion of the 164th took over about 500 yards of the line, and the 182nd Infantry battalions, on either side of the 164th Infantry, extended their flanks to join with those of the 164th. During the first 3 days of the operation, supplies for the units west of the Matanikau had been carried forward by hand from the river line. The engineers finally succeeded in building a footbridge over the flooded Matanikau, but the bridge for heavy vehicles was not completed until 21 November. The 1st Battalion of the 182nd attacked west from the Point Cruz area on 21 November. It met heavy artillery and mortar fire, as well as small arms fire from some Japanese entrenched on Point Cruz itself, the beach on the west, and the nearby hills and ravines. The battalion reduced Point Cruz, but failed to advance west. The battalions of the 164th Infantry also attacked to the west on 21 November from the Hill 80-81 ridgeline. A ravine about 200 feet deep, varying in width from 150 to 300 feet, lay directly in front of Hills 80 and 81. A series of steep ridges, Hills 83 and 82, lay west of the ravine. To get through the ravine and gain the ridges on the west, it would be necessary for the 164th Infantry to cross about 50 yards of open ground on the ridge. Between 11 and 18 November, the Japanese had built strong positions, containing a large number of automatic weapons, in the hills and ravines, and on the flat ground west of Point Cruz. The hill positions, well dug in on the reverse slopes, were defiladed from American artillery and mortar fire. Machine guns sighted at the head of each ravine could put flanking fire into advancing troops. The ravine in front of Hills 81-80 was especially well defended. On the flat ground, in places where a thin layer of earth covered a coral shelf, the Japanese had dug shallow pits with overhead cover, as well as foxholes under logs and behind trees. These positions, organized in depth, were mutually supporting. Small arms supported the automatic weapons, and artillery and mortars could cover the entire American front. Japanese fire quickly halted the 164th Infantry after it had made an average gain of less than 40 yards. The 182nd and 164th Regiments attacked again on 22 November, but failed to make progress. In the afternoon, the 8th Marines was notified that it was to pass through the 164th Infantry the next day to attack toward Hill 83. After the infantry had withdrawn 300 yards behind the front lines early on 23 November, the 245th Field Artillery Battalion and L Battery and the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 11th Marines fired a 30-minute concentration on the Japanese lines. The 8th Marines then passed through the 164th Infantry and delivered successive attacks against the Japanese throughout the day. The regiment was supported by the artillery, which fired 2,628 rounds of all calibers. During the bombardment, Hyakutake and the 17th Army Chief of Staff were slightly injured at their command post near Kokumbona. The American forces failed to gain. The Japanese, defending vigorously, put fire all along the entire American lines. The 3rd Battalion of the 164th Infantry was hit by accurate fire. In the afternoon of 23 November, mortar fire struck the command posts of L, I, and K companies and annihilated the battalion surgeon, 4 lieutenants, and 1 first sergeant. American headquarters concluded that, Further advance would not be possible without accepting casualties in numbers to preclude the advisability of continuing this action. The troops were ordered to dig in to hold the hill, 66-80-81 Point Cruz line. The attack had ended in a stalemate. Operations up to 23 November had demonstrated that frontal attack would be costly. By 25 November, less than 2,000 men of the 164th Infantry were fit for combat. Between 19 and 25 November, 117 of the 164th had been annihilated, and 208 had been wounded. 325 had been evacuated from the island because of wounds or illness, and 300 more men, rendered ineffective by wounds, malaria, dysentery, or neuroses, were kept in the rear areas. The 1st Marine Division was soon to be relieved, and its impending departure would reduce American troop strength too greatly to permit the execution of any flanking movements over the hills south of Hill 66. Until reinforcements could be brought in, the westward offensive had to be suspended. The attacks on 18-23 November had, however, achieved some success. Hyakutake's plan to recapture the Matanikau's east bank had been thwarted, although in November he secretly began to increase his strength on Mount Austin. American troops had finally established permanent positions west of the Matanikau. The Americans and the Japanese now faced one another at close ranges, the Americans on high ground, the Japanese on reverse slopes and in ravines. Each side could cover the opponent's lines with rifle, automatic, mortar, and artillery fire, and put mortar and artillery fire on the trails and rear areas. Americans and Japanese were to hold these static but dangerous lines until the beginning of the 14th Corps' general offensive in January.